Hello, and welcome to the next video in Project Muni. Right now, we're going to look at Power Browser's UX, and we're going to dig in a little bit into how the code will need to work because this needs to be integrated in the UX experience. Right here, I have a chart showing the browser's history. We can see that Chrome, when it takes off, just like our shuttle, and we can also see that mobile becomes very popular too. And we can see that blue Internet Explorer tanks and Firefox big, but is steadily going down. And Safari has its ups and downs, and everything else here has its ups and downs. But we need to keep in mind here that mobile is not discussing what type of engine it's running on. And Chrome actually runs from Chromium engine. And now, as we look at Internet Explorer, that eventually gets moved over to Edge, which Edge is running on Chromium. Opera is running on Chromium. Brave is running on Chromium, and so many others are running on Chromium. Firefox is also open source, but it's different engines. So at the end of the day, it might look like we have a number of browsers, but we're only left with two, just Chromium-based browsers and Firefox. That's about it. Everything else is something different. Safari, that's something we can go into later, but really we're just left with these two browser engines, and everything else is now just getting built off of the source code of these. So we're going to now dig into a little bit about what these browsers have and what some of their disadvantages are for today's work environment. Let's look over tab management. Now, in a nutshell, tab management stinks. You have a million tabs up, and you just keep on getting them up. It eats your RAM alive and is not fun to navigate. It's a far big improvement from where it was, where you had to open up multiple browsers, and each one was just another Internet Explorer, and this is where tabs stem from. But it's still a bit out of date for today's needs. And even the way it still works is each tab is essentially just a little browser that just sits open. Each one has its own engine that it is running on independently of the other tabs. So one of the ways Opera has dealt with this issue is allowing you to move tabs into different sections, and I can title them like my general area, my communication tabs that have all my emails and all my different areas I might get messages from. If I'm researching grants and donations, my web browser design that I'm currently working on. And I can right click on the tabs and move them to different workspaces, but other than that, right now, there's not too many management systems really designed out there. There was a few in the past, and there still is a few running today. One of them was to color coordinate your tabs. One of my favorite ones was Firefox allowed you to drag boxes of different sizes, resize them, then grab each tab, move them into another one, pile them up, right-click and make a new tab. But ultimately, this tab grouping was canceled by Firefox because only 1 in 10,000 people knew about it. Probably this was partly because of Firefox's problem. At first, it was in the top corner where you had click on the groups, but then they removed that whole button. The only way to bring it up was to right-click, add more buttons, find it in the bottom of the list, add it back into there, and have this. And Firefox never really liked these groups, even though you could put titles in each one of them and organize them, because they never worked out the code, and all the tabs were running all the little engines at once. So I remember amassing 750 tabs, and it was like 750 tabs eating your RAM alive. So they ultimately just canceled this some years ago. due to the lack of enthusiasm of ever using it. But it did have a niche following to it. And that 1 in 10,000 might not sound like much, but with today's workers working on, say, Upwork, having a different client and all their little projects they're working in each one, or you're working at home, this is now you're working at home, then you have your other group of tabs that you're working on with your communication. This is something that we're seeing would be a need, but not in this form. There has been some reinventions of tab grouping, such as this one that's kind of duplicating the tab grouping, but it's still not the same kind of almost mind mapping of dragging and dropping boxes the way this one kind of was. Almost like just files sitting on a desktop was the design. And this is where you have to, for the UX, balance rigidness of the UX with its fluidness. If you make it kind of sloppy, it allows you a bit more fluidness. If you make it a bit more rigid, yes, it looks nicer, but how well does it end up feeling? We'll look into tab management later, but currently, almost every browser, you're just stuck with one thing that looks like this, just a million tabs up. And really, there's not much more than just some side buttons that few people ever utilize and make for different sessions of your browser. Let's look at multiple logins on a browser. Now, this is usually not that intuitive. When we open one tab and then move to another tab, the login can still be the same for that particular account. Other times not, just depending on what browser you're using. But this is really where it can get quite frustrating for many, is that in order to switch your account inside one browser session, you have to click on your user account in Google, for example, and click on which account you're utilizing. And many of us end up having multiple accounts, especially creators for content, people who have a work email account and a personal email account and both happen to be on Google. This can just go for Google, Microsoft, Office. The list just keeps on going on of how often you'll experience this. I even experienced it with Amazon. I had my personal Amazon account, my business Amazon account, and my Amazon selling account, and my Amazon AWS server account. And sometimes it could even lock me up in the system. You experience this with banks, where you have multiple bank accounts. The list just keeps on going on where you have this. And oftentimes you even have to log out of one session and then log into another session. Now, some people bypass this by just simply having multiple web browsers and just logging in to each web browser in order to not have a spillover of the login from one to another. This is just a mess. That's the only way you can describe this. This is a complete mess. RAM utilization is just terrible. And even worse, oftentimes we can see that each tab is put into its own task. Yet, how are we to define this? I mean, this is Chrome right here, but when I click down this, look at all this stuff open right here. What's going on? What if a plugin crashes? How can I just stop that plugin? So this is not very useful if one tab overflows, crashes. I just exit out of the browser. I can't even problem solve what's wrong in this. And if I keep on scrolling down, I'm going to find more Google Chrome components. In fact, even when I close out of Chrome, it still is taking up RAM. And you'll be able to look in the bottom right here and still see it running. And unless you right click on and hit exit, it's still eating your RAM. Now, some browsers have tried to find some solutions to this. Let's look at one of them. So I'm not going to say the name of that browser right there. has come up with one solution from it. These guys are an offshoot of Opera. Essentially, when the Opera team divided at one point, some of the original people went to build this browser, and other people went to continue working on Opera. This was when Opera decided to fork their code away from their original engine and move to the Chromium engine. So they had one interesting feature in here, and it's when we go to a task manager right here. And you can see that I can at least see each part of the browser that is running. And when I click on tabs, you can see that the tabs are actually popping up in the task manager because they're being brought out of a state. Now, I can actually right-click on these and I can hibernate the tab, and you can see it went down and now it's grayed out. And you can see the ones that are grayed out. This at least allows some level of permissions for tab management. In this form, I don't see anyone using this. I could even hibernate all the tabs, and I can always click the tab and task, and task, and task, and you can see that the tabs are still there. All I would just need to do is it keeps the whole entire URL and refresh it. So they do have at least the code in order to allow different states of tabs and management of the tabs, but in this form, there's no way anyone's ever going to really find much of a use case for it. But it's a good idea. We'll go back to this later and how this is useful. Let's look at framework and infrastructure here for a moment. Now, this may not seem relevant to a browser, but because almost everything that we're doing in PaaS, SaaS, dApps, smart contracts is all done through the framework, this is something that's oftentimes overlooked. Now, there's a level from centralized to completely decentralized, and let's say in the dead middle is distributed. There's a number of dApps and smart contracts that are actually on the more distributed end, and others are on the decentralized end. And although they won't say this because it stands against the whole idea of dApp, some of them are actually centralized. And we can look into this a little bit later in a security session for where there's inherent flaws with dApps. But your data layer sits on top of the application. Now, the application is oftentimes the web browser. And the data layer is what we're more or less accessing and looking at in that session of the browser. And underneath that, eventually we move all the way to the operating system, and then even the physical location where the computer is, and then your network and how it ends up going out. All this plays a part into the security, and all this plays a part into how decentralized it ends up being. If the computer is sitting in your home, it's not decentralized if everything's running on it. How can we end up making something decentralized? And that's something that the open blockchain ends up dealing with, is that there is no central location. So more and more things are really moving to PaaS and SaaS, and dApps are starting to merge on the scene. But there's one big problem. They're running in JavaScript, and they're running through HTML and CSS, which then runs on your web browser. And the only way for it to even access that is to go to a website, which is now a centralized server. So all of a sudden, these dApps become no more than just SaaS. Just the database is still running on a private blockchain and an open blockchain, I hope. And that's really, I hope, when you look into how some of these infrastructures are working. A lot of people are going to end up getting screwed in the future when they find that all of a sudden everything was extremely hackable. in the blockchain space because it was never really decentralized or even the benefit of a doubt being distributed. And in many cases, distributed still means that they can at least read what the code is doing as it's working on. Consortium is something else to bring up that's not mentioned in this, but even they have their problems. Celestial computing is going to be a hybrid of these in a lot of ways as far as its physical layer goes. And the reason why it's not done yet is each application actually builds out the layers that it needs in each part for its own purposes. So it ends up being an amalgam of really all this merged into each individual app. And that might sound complicated, but when we look at it later, it's actually going to be easier than any of these. And it's actually amazing how this is going to pull together inside a serverless system. But we'll look at that later. Let's right now look at some apps and dApps and see how they work through web browsers. Let's first look at Saya. Now, Saya has been building out something called Skynet, which allows you to run applications actually decentralized. And in my opinion, this is one of the most advanced and economical ways of running a dApp. Now, in order to run one of these dApps inside your browser, you're going to have to install a little plugin. You can go to the website and access it, but that's still going through a server. Now, there is a way to access these dApps by putting a little plugin in your browser, and it will end up working. Now, one thing to note about the UX is this is just a very, very small swapping app that you drag and drop you click down your menus on what you're swapping to, and you can put your codes in for, your Bitcoin account, your ETH account, and swap. This type of app is being used heavily in cryptocurrency and will be used more and more in these decentralized exchanges as they merge onto the field. But they do have a problem, though, is that in order to get to it through your browser, you need to install a little plugin to it. And in addition, you end up having to just use that one URL to even move into. And then even, why are we switching Bitcoin to Ethereum too? This is probably because we need to use the ETH inside an app. Why can't this just auto trade for us what we already had the Bitcoin into and move over to it? So this almost needs to be inherent into the framework. And eventually these apps will probably end up being more merged into what we're doing. There are so many protocols inside the decentralized space, but each one takes a microtransaction in order to run it, and there's not something built into the browser to do each microtransaction. On the Skynet, they're already coming up with playing videos, and in some cases, those videos that you'll play cost just 1,000th of a cent, let's say, but we need a way of having that microtransaction to run each transaction that we're doing. And this is just not really built into the browser yet to handle microtransactions as a protocol for all different cryptocurrencies. Here's another app. This is my ETH wallet. I think many people have used blockchain have seen this. It ends up being a little SaaS program that you access on the web and can then deal with what is going on in your transactions with ETH. But this is still requiring you to make those requests outside of your computer. And if you're anyone that can think of how this might end up being dangerous, there could always be middlemen, there can always be other things. You're not directly accessing the Ethereum blockchain. Although this is generally very safe, it still is not allowing you to really work in the decentralized space, even inside this ETH wallet, which is the most popular ETH wallet out there. Imagine that. The most popular Ethereum wallet is actually still moving through centralized means because we have it built into the browser, and the browser does not have inherent abilities to run itself decentralized. dApps in general that are growing still have to run from the browser. Whether you're running on Tron or EOS or Steam, they're still running through the browser, talking to a server, just as centralized as ever. And this is interesting. It's not brought up more often how insecure this actually ends up being. If the browser could directly talk to the Ethereum network, the EOS network, the Tron network, etc., this would really help there to be a lot more trust in decentralization from the framework itself. At the moment, the framework still oftentimes has to pull the APIs from a centralized server just to access Tron, as an example. It's not like your browser can talk to one of these networks. Even though the app itself may be running in JavaScript, its APIs are making calls from a centralized server. And do we trust that centralized server? Well, if you use these apps, you have to trust that centralized server. So there's no real way to code in JavaScript and code these in a way that you could natively use them in the way that's fun to code, such as the way we're coding the languages in a browser, and yet at the same time still keep it 100% decentralized. This is something that's going to need to end up changing. One group of people that have been changing this is Electron. Now, Electron is a little Chromium engine that runs your code in a way that basically takes the browser and makes it into one program. So if we coded a calculator, we can make that in a web browser, basically. We can now make you able to download this calculator and then run it natively on Windows, run it natively on Linux or Mac. So you only coded the calculator in a browser, and then you can natively run it on anything because this is still running from the calculator's perspective on a browser. Now, we can do more. When you install this Electron app, you might install some back-end framework that connects to a blockchain, does a few other things. Then your little app makes some API calls that talks to that framework that's on the computer and then runs it. Some people have even tried to build web browsers inside Electron, but they've had problems. We'll look at one of them in a little bit, but the big problem is you don't have Chromium and Google Chrome plugins and extension support, because this is just really building out not the browser, but the tab window inside the browser. So even Discord is built on Electron. Slack is built on Electron. Many coding programs such as Visual Studio Code is built on Electron. And Electron, think about it, could even run Flux, but now you wouldn't need internet access. You could run Flux natively on your computer if you jammed it into Electron. So Electron allows you to run all these SaaS programs natively on your computer. Of course, Electron is great at what it does for single apps, but it's not so great for running multiple applications at once. But this has really been a game changer for how we can build apps, and now build apps with web browsing language and rapidly build and deploy them. And this really shows the advantages of how along the language for building in a browser has come versus trying to code this calculator app in C++, which coding its UI and everything would just not be fun. So this is a real success story, and we can build off of this in the browser of the future. We'll look at that in a bit. Let's look at a web store here for a second. This is the Chrome Web Store. Now, even though I'm in Opera, as you can see, I can still put a plugin to allow this to plug into Opera, because as I said, the engine behind Opera is in fact Chromium based. So one of the problems with extensions at the moment is they're amazing. They allow you to plug in so much stuff that is really cool, and extensions are used all the time. They're very popular, but they're not exactly that powerful. I can't, with an extension, for example, remake my UX, redesign my UI, rebuild how the RAM utilization works, maybe run extra features empowering the way in which my window opens and displays. I mean, I can modify some little things with it, but these are not incredibly powerful. And the more powerful they end up getting, the more pain in the butt they become to code. So even if you can do it, you're going to want to avoid it because the coding is just too cumbersome. But here's just a look at extensions and tabs, and really what we're going to end up needing is much more powerful and advanced extensions moving into the future. So these will not be extensions that work in the window, but an extension to the browser itself, not something that sits inside the engine in the tab. We're going to need something that sits at a much higher level. Okay, safety and security in web browsers. Well, let's look this up on Google. I'm sure that's going to tell us. And, first result is McAfee. You know, we all trust McAfee. We all have McAfee since when just about every computer you buy comes pre-installed with McAfee. So I'm sure Dell and HP only want you to have the best. I'm sure it has nothing to do with McAfee paying to have that installed. This really goes into the whole problem of security is where do we end up getting trust in what browser we use? How do we end up trusting the framework behind the browser? And let's look into some of the big complaints in security. Let's talk about what open source is. So open source code means that you can read and understand the code and you can edit it. There's also rights to that code. Do you have the right to redistribute that code? Do you have the right to sell the code in your own product? So just looking at open source for a second here, yes, the whole code might be made open source, but that doesn't mean that you can understand the code necessarily. One area that's in particular is this Google search bar right here. Google doesn't really want you messing with this in Chromium, and this is why programs like Ungoogled Chrome, where Brave is coming from and Opera has had to rewrite this search bar here, you'll notice does a lot of things. As I type in things with it, it comes up with pre-thought out responses, and one of this is to help you find things that you've previously gone to, but also give suggestions. Google does not want you messing with this. This is where Google implants ideas into your head. This is where it sells stuff to you. This is where Google makes its money. And they don't want you messing with this. So when it comes to Chromium, even though it is open source, the code to this makes no sense. So if you want to make your own browser and change this, this is not something you can do. Plus, every letter you type into this gets sent back to Google so that they can analyze how you're thinking, how you're moving through. And even when you're typing in something like, what does HA, and it's starting to guess what each one of these things might say, it's sending all this back, whether it's in the URL or not. And this is partly how they analyze and market to you. So the URL bar has come under some scrutiny with Chromium, Chrome, Firefox, as far as it being one of the primary ways of marketing. In fact, Opera and even some of the other browsers I showed you, one of the ways they make money is to sell the rights to this bar right here to a particular company and how that data is sent out. So this URL bar is really where they make their money. What you type in here, how it pulls it up, this is where the money's coming from, and this is something that's gone under some scrutiny. Let's look at the next thing that has come under some security issues, as this one reveals a lot of personal information that not everyone wants to reveal. Background requests are just being sent nonstop from everything you do. Whether it is monitoring what the previous website that you were just on and allowing some level of tracking so that way you can have targeted advertising, monitoring requests that you end up doing on the page, knowing who the previous people have moved there, from that site, knowing connections with these people and building information about these users. You're sending a lot of information for statistical reasons. Now, not saying all this is bad, but oftentimes we're not really aware of everything that's ending up going on, and this is something that's been complained about a bit within browsers. And we want to know that I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad thing, but it is an inevitability, and it would be a bit nice to better understand everything that is being sent and be able to have the option of not having everything sent in order for it to get working the way it should. This can sometimes get really extreme in tracking in where your mouse hovers. How long does it hover on something? And knowing that just because you hovered on this, that's something that you were thinking about to later either target advertise you or say, you need more view time, click on this fireplace. You keep on hovering on fireplaces. Or, hey, you keep on hovering on girls. Here's more pictures of girls. This is something that it tracks your eye time and where you're even looking at to send more statistical data to better optimize the site in order to know what would keep you on that site longer. Now, Chrome had some interesting things like incognito windows, and you could browse incognito and search for things. And a lot of people thought this was going to be blocking everything from statistics, but it turned out it really wasn't. And they've gone under some fire for this. But the fact is, when you're trying to find different ways of browsing when you need to and different levels of security, there's not an intuitive way to do this except for clicking on and opening up a new tab, if anybody even knew about that, a new window or whatever they've concocted in some other browser. This is just not very easily usable. And everything from what tabs you have open to what's in your favorites oftentimes is sent back to the browsing company, which is a two-handed weapon in the way. One, it can hurt us, and in another way, it can end up helping us. It helps us because they end up optimizing the browser a bit better. But then at the same time, it ends up creating more targeted advertising just to find out any way they could to milk us one more second to have us pause on an ad when we hover over it, or pop up that same ad again, but in a different way on another site to get us to go to that ad again. And by keeping all this statistic on us, it's oftentimes just used to milk our eye time and more overwhelm us in a way of spending our precious time on something that the company wants more than what we were even trying to remember what we were doing. So this is another complaint that's gone under fire in recent years. There are also security flaws inside Chrome itself, and these are getting continuously patched. This is one reason why it's really moved to just Firefox and Chrome, because everybody else can help contribute code to the security problems, and this can get patched. But if you had 50 different engines out there, there'd be so many bugs and so many different ones. So yes, this might end up causing an advantage in one way. We would know all the flaws in every one of them, but also it's just so expensive to do security that we wind up with really just two engines, mainly at the end of the day. Now, one security flaw I was reading about they're still working on patching is if you end up opening up a tab, then you say went to another site, the cookies placed in to where I was just at can sometimes have access inside that tab to the next site you move into. I'm oversimplifying this, but it would allow you a runaway of inside this tab to continue accessing every other subsequent thing you ended up doing. So theoretically, if I went to this bad malicious site and then went to my bank account, it would have access to everything I was typing in that next bank account. This is oversimplifying it, but these are real security concerns built into the engine itself. And this is why web browsers need constant updates. And in addition, they need to be supported by very large companies, the engine, in order to maintain security, because even Google missed this one. This was not a problem for Firefox, but Firefox has had its own security issues as well. So security being in a browser is a big issue. And at the end of the day, we're safer with the giants when it comes to security than a small web browser, simply because they're able to update the code. So if we're going to build a browser, we're going to need to stick with the engine of one of the big ones that's continuously getting updated, and we need to be able to make their new code be able to merge into our browser rapidly as security fixes come up. So wrapping up security within a browser and privacy, it just needs to be intuitive, and it needs to be made for non-technical users. And Google's trying to do this, such as putting in a lock icon right here, and we can see how this has been secured with a certificate, and removing information in the front of this, which could get confusing with HTTPW. You could trick people with what website it was on. I just made it show up right here. And security, you don't want it to be so complicated that people end up not using it. Security needs to be simple and intuitive in everyday life, not hard to implement and deploy, because then most people will end up not using it. And this is a very, very hard thing to implement. There are password managers out there that try to simplify things. There's a lot of applications that try to build security into the browser, but ultimately at the end of the day, there is just so many security issues you have to be aware of, and it just needs to be intuitive inside the UX. So let's look at the coding perspective of Muni and how it needs to be, what the architecture is going to be like, and really how to get about doing this. So this is not really made for coders. This is just made from a UX perspective. A side note, Electron is like a little browser that is just simply one of these little threads just running all by itself, but running the program inside it. And this is why some Electron apps simply are not able to run full-blown browsers, even though some people have really tried to do this. You really need the low-level support of accessing the CPU, the RAM, making different engines, controlling how they'll end up working and rendering. So the UX of the future really needs to be able to have access to low-level support, and there needs to be some modularity to it. The browser itself needs to have API calls for each button, and just easily coding every aspect of the browser in something as easy as JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Then just making calls to the buttons and what they'll end up doing. There needs to also be more advanced coding for some things as well, but still, this needs to allow modularity for each part of it. This is the only way to get your dApps and all working together congruently on the same program. Otherwise, you have a mess of programs all open. So you're going to need very advanced plugins that allow you to build out each part of the browser itself and make it modular. This will obviously be some part of a library. The UX needs languages that are fast and easy to code. As we're just talking about, JavaScript's one of them. Another one would be Python. But you need to be able to include a multitude of languages and allow not just one, but any. This way, you have it a lot easier. Yes, What holds the UX might be, say, coded in C++, but each little applet or component needs to be able to accept different types of codes. The UX needs to be self-managing of the RAM and the CPU usage, not just having everything up all running full blast, but having it have different states. And this needs to be intuitive as we move, minimize, maximize, however this is going to work, in order to control how much RAM we're eating and how much of the CPU it's going to be running. Ultimately, the engine needs to allow for different types of engines to run at the same time. We might be having the engine running the browser, but we might need also another engine running a blockchain, and we'll need another engine running something else. All these engines need to be able to be called and pulled inside of Muni. And this is actually going to be a bit more simple than what it might first sound. So that's kind of a basic overview from a coder's perspective on what the UX needs to be. It needs to be extremely modular and easy within its modularity. And I believe I have a solution on how to do this, and that's what I'm going to show you next. So let's show some of the modularity that Unreal Engine built. Now, we're going to try to not get overwhelmed with what Unreal Engine does and just focus on how it created a modular system to allow a ton of buttons, a ton of settings, and yet be able to organize and manage all these panels and windows. So we're going to call these areas up here more or less sessions. And we are then going to call these tabs right here. So I can drag a tab, I can grab it and pull on it, and then I get this box around here, and I can snap it in different locations. If I hold it right here, I can see that it is about to snap a panel, and then it pulls the other panel over to the other side. Now, I can snap it down to the bottom right here, and it snapped back to the way it was. Now, notice there's this little yellow thing here. When I click it, it pulls up the panel like this. I can right-click it and hide the panel again. All panels have tabs for the exception of the top bar and these settings, which, as you can see, these settings bar changes depending on what window I am. Now, I don't think this is useful for Muni, as we could just have clicking on, say, the M in the top of it for Muni, and having a drag down of meta buttons. But this is how they ended up dealing with it, is this just this meta button bar changes in different sections. Now, I can drag this, and when I pull it over one, there's quadrants. There's a top quadrant, a side quadrant, left and right, of course, and a bottom quadrant. Dragging on the bottom quadrant brings it that way. If I bring it up to the top quadrant, it just snaps the other one down to the bottom. And I can, of course, drag this, and I can find which quadrant I want to move it to. And I get an idea of what this is going to look like. So this is an intuitive way to move your toolbars, and an intuitive way to have multiple tabs open at the same time. Of course, these bars interact with each other. Now, there's another feature as well when we get in bigger modes that I can drag and resize sections. And this resizing capability is really cool. Now, we can also see that we can drag more than one tab here. We can, of course, drag one tab, and we can pull it off in its own separate window. We can drag the tab and snap it down in there into another section. We could even snap the tab into a section right in here. And of course, we can pull the tab right back to where it was. So this allows high levels of modularity and how we end up having it created. And as you can see, all these little yellow areas have different points that we can end up pulling through them. So this allows you to navigate a huge amount of buttons, just a crazy amount of options and settings, and be able to build your components out so that way you end up being able to build the video game. We could, of course, expand our view here, and let's move this one off to the side because I want a little bigger viewing window. And you know what? These buttons, we're just going to move them. Let's move them into that panel right there. Looks nasty, but... And we can just expand this window out a little bit and see that. And let's say I don't like that. I can always just grab this panel, pull it down to the bottom, snap the toolbar, or move it back to where it more was. We can grab this content right here and pull it down to the bottom like that. So we have a lot of modularity that we can end up pulling through here. This really allows for an extremely intuitive user interface at the end of the day that's rapidly customizable. So you can cycle through how these panels end up interlinking together. And if you could think of this being useful for an admin console, think about this being useful for just so many different things that require a multitude of panels that are open and really require a modularity within tabs. This can really allow a rather intuitive use of when you need so many things open at once. Now, when we start to look at municipal software, workstation software, we're going to see why we're going to need just a multitude of little apps and applets open. So try to imagine these windows as their own little engines running, and some of them as just being buttons and tools which access and activate different parts of the window, possibly the one that you're highlighted on forward and backwards, and how we mean that we're moving in the website itself. Or the app, when it's open, just has options inside it. So we're going to look at how a lot of municipal software works, how civic software works, and why you're going to need an interface with so much information up at once. But probably most of you have seen how administrator consoles have been really expanding in recent years. You just need so many little bits of information open for each thing that you're doing. A user interface like this, just with SaaS, would already be easier to pay bills. If you just had one session that you could pull up for bills and have your windows open for each one of your banks and then just auto open each one of your windows, this would be a lot easier of a console to just handle even web work as we have it. But we're going to show what other companies have come up with solutions and what they did right and what they did wrong. So let's look at this browser. One interesting feature of this browser right here is I don't know what my tabs are, but I can hover over them. Now, an interesting feature is just to be able to grab it and just pull it down and then see, oh, that's all the tabs that I have up there. And I can always just slide it back up. This obviously, when you look at it, would work easily inside adding into Unreal Engine in that type of modularity. We already have bars on the side right here that we try to snap in with some of their own settings. And we have a whole bar right here at the top with snapping. And if only we could just grab the URL bar, move it, snap it, hide it, click on different parts. This modularity can already be moved into the web browser and allow a multitude of sessions. Let's look at a whole new type of UX experience when utilizing a browser. This is Shift right here. So Shift basically allows you to have sessions, more or less. Think of these as each account that you're logged into, and everything logged into that account is then going to be, well, set up. So my Google account is logged in here, and then I have my email, my calendar, my Drive, all my G apps, and I can always jump to another one. So this might be my personal life, and this might be my work life right here. And in here, I then have my Gmail, all this set up for me to now access. And this way I'm not mixing up what account I'm logged into. In addition, they added unified messages into it. So when I'm getting an email, when I'm getting a message, I can see all my messages all at once. I can see when my Slack is messaging me. I can see when Facebook is messaging me, and I can click in each one of them. So this allows a bunch of plugins to be added and really just allows less clutter and confusion of your apps. Now, this UX is not necessarily for me, but it may be really good for someone who has a lot of Google accounts and ends up clicking around on them. So this is where I was talking about having a modular UX, snapping in a panel and snapping in another panel and having a session that is, say, this type of UX. If that's you, having this built out is excellent for that right type of person. Now, Shift charges $100 a year for this browser, and it has actually been able to fund itself for quite some time, but they really messed up with their code. See, this is not actually coded on top of a web browser. This is coded up on top of Electron. So all of this was coded in JavaScript. And although this is running on top of Chromium, they have a big problem with this program. They actually do not allow Chrome extensions. So all your wonderful Chrome extensions won't work inside Shift. And that's not a mistake I'd want to make. Plus, it inherently is going to eat your RAM alive because you don't have that low-level support to regulate each tab with how your RAM is utilized. So let's look at another way of managing tabs and how we could manage sessions. But this is really cool because for the right person, this is an excellent interface. And there's been a number of workstation apps coming out that have actually been getting popular in recent years. So being able to build out different types of workstations is one thing that you'll be able to do with this modular UX. Let's look at tab management now. This is one piece of concept art for tab management. Now, as we can see, there are more or less different groupings of the tabs. We could think of these as different sessions as we'd set it up. We have archive tabs. We can just drag and drop where we want the tabs at. Then we have active tabs. Now, we're going to need the tabs in different states, and I think there's probably 3 states. There's active, which is sitting on the RAM and running. There is hibernated, and this has been removed from the RAM and moved to the drive. And then archived, I believe we would just want to take a screenshot of the last known image of what the page looked like with the URL, save it, and then call it archived. So we can see what that website looked like, But when we click on it, it's going to refresh, of course, deleting that image and then loading up all the code to bring the page up. A tab manager like this could easily fit within the modularity and allow for a bunch of tabs to be utilized, moving in and out from tabs to favorites and moving tabs to what workflow you're doing, and even manage your sessions depending on where you want these tabs open in your session at. You could easily make groupings of tabs so that when it comes bills time, you click bills and then pull out that grouping of tabs into active automatically by just clicking open all, and move them in and out in cycles so that you can move through your sessions. Now, with NAND getting so fast on SSDs, moving in and out of a hibernated state to an active state can happen extremely fast. And the nice advantage of this is it doesn't really need to reload the page as the data is there. Plus, it will not be eating your RAM. So you could quickly move in and out of different states in a manager such as this. Of course, it would have to be a bit of a modification of something of this, but this is just an example of using snapping panels and how we can build out little apps to all different designs. Looking back at Firefox and the way they group their tabs, you could easily still group this within sessions and move to another panel and drag and drop your boxes whatever size you want them. Drop your individual tabs into each folder, if you will, seeing what's inside the folder and navigate it in another way. The cool thing is that you would be able to have these built out rapidly so that no matter who you are, you're going to find a way to interact with your individual tabs, which these tabs are soon going to become individual apps, such as a Discord app, a Slack app. Each one of these is going to become its own little DApp, as it is its own little program in and of itself. This allows you to bring up multiple programs at once when you're doing trade, administrator work, just freelancing work. This is where you're going to have a bit more modularity for that control panel and workstation we've been always wanting. Password managers have become so critically important for how we keep ourselves safe and how we even have the convenience of navigating. LastPass being probably the most popular password manager out there right now. It allows you to really use passwords in some ways as favorites, navigating in between all your different devices, allowing you that if in the event of your death, you would be able to have somebody get access to your account, and allowing really a higher degree of security when you use multi-factor authentication. Password managers have really opened up a door into security that we really should never not be using one. There's just no safe way to remember a unique enough password for each app these days. And even though one password for all to get inside this manager may not seem safe to many, in reality, it actually is a lot safer when you combine it with another form of authentication, such as a security key. Or there's a number of other things that you can combine it with for third-level authentication. You could even combine more layers of authentication. This is something that we've actually worked on to integrate in building a better password manager. But one problem with all these password managers is they're not really built on decentralized technology. And yes, LastPass and all of them do get hacks and all the data gets stolen. Although it's unlikely they'd ever be able to break the encryption to get into your passwords, and that's not really end up being a threat. It still if you used certain decentralized technologies, like as we had shown earlier from Saya, you would be able to access all your passwords, all your secure information, and nobody else would be able to get onto it. Plus, there's no server you ever have to worry about being taken down, no censorship from a country. If all of a sudden, for some reason, your password manager was censored, all these problems just go away. So, password managers, what we have a takeaway with is we need to be able to allow as many password managers as possible. That's why we want to enable extensions so LastPass still works. But also, we're going to want to build out our own password manager to allow you to work with cryptocurrencies, keeping your keys in one place to move it from one to the other without this control cut copy, which can be really scary if you lose one digit. And also, it's not sensitive to making a dumb mistake like sending Bitcoin to Bitcoin Cash or Ethereum to Ethereum Classic. I've actually done that, and I've known other people to make those kind of mistakes. They can be very simple to make and be very costly, sending your coins essentially to oblivion. And you're going to want integrated in the password manager to allow you to move codes in a way that keeps you safe. And this is just something that's not capable within today's password managers. And surprisingly, password managers are going to not be that hard to code. They're really not that complicated, but we're going to want possibly even something like LastPass to still be able to integrate into our current password manager and share passwords between the two. Now, LastPass has not made this feature, but why would we want that? Because we may not have coded Muni to say work on our watch or Muni to work on our phone. Well, LastPass, we can just have it share the passwords to it so it can automatically work. One nice thing about Muni, the way it's being coded, is to code it so that one app can copy its information into another app is going to be made possible inside the infrastructure of Muni. So this way we can have multiple password managers and one password manager that we can build out that can work with other systems to help keep us a lot safer and keep things much more convenient. Let's overgeneralize what a municipal might end up be doing and just look at it kind of broadly. Think of a municipal on a scale as something that is smaller than a city, which is then smaller, which then a city is smaller than a state. And a municipal is broken down into different departments. One department might be dealing with accounting. Another one might be dealing with payrolls. Another one might be dealing with the payments and managing expenses. So QuickBooks is a piece of software which allows you to manage as much as possible inside your organization and do this. QuickBooks starts to utilize a number of workflows and a number of panels to move through this. Ultimately, a lot of the versions of QuickBooks I've used kind of stink because each one's made for its own organization. One for-profit might be very well optimized, but the one for nonprofit may not be. And each one is not very well able to be updated because they are more or less different. In other words, they would have to update the entire program. But if someone updated just the pay bills section of QuickBooks, well, you wouldn't be easily able to have the pay bills now for the nonprofit updated. But with a modular system where each one of these ends up being a little applet that we click on and move through, and we can organize our workflows, whether we're using this to manage the way we move our money or more at a corporate board level, we're using Kanban. Each one of these little areas is its own little app. So municipal software can then get a bit more complicated when we move on to something else like zoning. And we get really complicated with this. We have to end up entering in each individual region where it's at, check out the zoning with it, see information on who lives there already, the names of each thing, and design this out. So municipal software is also industry specific, and you need something different for each industry. But there's still some overlap, like you still might be doing something like paying bills, creating invoices. So you could have 5 or 6 different little applets that create invoices all the same, while this zoning software is its own little program. And the cool thing about this modular design is a lot of software that's already been created, already exists, such as this right here, will be able to be made plugged in to a module, allowing there to be a bit of an easier use instead of getting a mess of windows as much. Now, municipal software, one of the biggest things is just keeping databases of records and modifying those database records. This is why blockchain's really going to be the future of this. This is where towns will want to implement such a software that we're designing where, hey, you can enter in your information that you end up needing for your records, all of this in a very secure way. And then because it's also based on blockchain, these records can be made public when necessary and private where necessary. Also, all changes, everything like that can be tracked. This really prevents corruption from seeping into the system, but it's going to have to be built from the ground up so that way we can make this a serverless system running on the ideals of celestial computing. What we end up needing is we're going to need it to be rapidly buildable. And as you can see, this really looks old-fashioned. It probably is. The fact is, and it's really a pain to code and update, most likely too. It might use a language that's really old. I don't know. But the government doesn't update things because it's such a pain to change. Moving over to languages that are much easier to code today will greatly improve this. And creating a modular design so that you can organize your municipality should be a lot better. Now, I want to go over permissions for a second here, but I don't want to make them complicated because permissions get very complicated. This is Discord, and you have different rules, and you make the rules, and you can drag and drop and click them in together. Ultimately, this software is going to have to manage the rules of what each person does in each session, and you're going to have to be able to create sessions and be able to give them out to different employees, more or less pre-built, pre-made, so that way you can move through employees at different hours of the day and hire new employees, and as employees leave, be able to replace them. So creating a modular session and then being able to build out what the perms are is going to be very important. Now, this perming system is far too simple for all but the simplest municipality. But we're going to go through a little bit later how we can build out the permissions for each account in a very intuitive way later on, looking into the municipal engine and why we're going to need this modularity to be able to give each person within the company, the government, the organization, the church, different perms to access and change, whether it's a form of messages or rights to their real estate. So this is something we're going to look into a bit later, but we're going to have to connect communication into this municipal engine, and we're going to have some level of verification that when I click on this person right here, I can then send them cryptocurrency or pay them for the day or send them dollars to their checking account. I also need to verify maybe I don't know who they are and I need to have pseudonymity. Something like this Integrate Upwork already tries to sell some insurance in order for you to hire people on a very expensive, over 20% cost just to be able to do this. With blockchain technology merging on the scenes, the cost of this is going to be much cheaper. So we're going to need a way to talk to people and then yet verify with smart contracts how to hire them and manage them within the company. And we'll look into this a bit later. This is a screenshot of Open Government. Now, Open Government is a program that is above a municipal level, and think of it more organizing the government itself. So as a politician or as somebody who's working for politicians, think of this as a much higher level. You're going to have to get an idea of statistics of who's moving in, how to regulate things, where are charts and statistics going in each department of your entire city. And Open Government, as you can see, ends up creating all different types of little statistics, drawing up budgets at each municipality level, and allows you to organize it. This is really where looking into this is that each one of these ends up being built out as its own little app, its own little applet. So creating a modularity to be able to look at multiple statistics at once would be very helpful. Obviously, somebody who's big into trade, where you know that Bitcoin and Ethereum move together, you'll notice that. Let's look at that in 1 second. Looking at CoinMarketCap, when you're doing trading, we all know that Bitcoin and Ethereum move together and the larger cryptos all end up moving together. If you've ever done trading, you're going to want to be able to look at not only multiple cryptocurrencies at once, but multiple exchanges. How is one exchange moving differently from another exchange? You're going to want to look at a lot of statistics, the latest news in one window, and then ultimately what you're buying in, what you're selling out of, and everything that you're in. Having multiple snap windows to just be a trader would be very helpful, as you need so many windows open at once. And although you might be using multiple monitors, a modular system with the UX would really allow you to snap and see each item that you're looking at, working with, already in or already coming out of. So that's just another thought within this, though, is that this modular design works for so many things that we're already doing, where people are really glued to their computer and they need access to a lot of different types of information all at once. And the cool thing about this modular design is we can integrate it with so many pre-existing systems already right now. Let's end with looking at a dApp or two. Here's one dApp called Library. And essentially what they're trying to do is make a peer-to-peer sharing network of videos that can offset YouTube's censorship. And they're also trying to make a competitor to Amazon, although I have not seen this built out. They claim to be a nonprofit foundation, although when I've investigated into them, they're in New Hampshire and they are not a 501c3, and they're not even registered as a not-for-profit. But this just goes into how apps are probably going to end up being, their companies around them are scams. But their product, though, seems at least legitimate, even if the company behind it's a bit shady, calling themselves a non-profit foundation when they're not even registered as that. So one thing about this program, though, is when you click on a video and it downloads, it's downloading through a peer-to-peer network, then you end up having access to that files. Now, you can click this person and you can thumbs them up, and when you do this, it sends them a little bit of money, essentially. Now, the cool thing about this wallet system is that it actually will pay content creators oftentimes 10 times more for the same content than YouTube. So for content creators, this really does appear to be a better system than YouTube for many. Plus, it's not censorship prone. But if you want to buy more of this coin to send to your favorite YouTubers, it, of course, is its own little cryptocurrency that is unique to this platform, and you're going to have to end up trading it. Well, this is where you're really going to want a platform that links everything together so that my wallet automatically inside that platform can then move that coin and do the microtransactions needed to make those 1 cent payments or less to each one of these people. Also, to prevent hacking for somebody just downloading nonstop on the network, it costs a little to download a video, and you make a little bit, I believe, when you upload content for videos for other people to see. So this type of network is one way of showing a peer-to-peer sharing similar to Torrent, only set up for its own little ecosystem. Now, this runs on Electron, so all of this is really just a web browser component and could easily be put into just one tab with an API that just sends and receives the public and private key in and out of your wallet that can connect and allow the permissions for this to, if you're a content creator, move it to a cryptocurrency that, or write to US dollars or to your bank account. This is where we need to merge our funds all into a more universal type of fund. And this is an example of where micropayments empower an entire platform. I've been talking with someone who's been building out a platform that essentially does everything that eBay does with security that is 100% decentralized. These apps are already being built and coming, but there is no library, there is no library of apps, there's no store of dApps where you can get these. You would have to download each one individually. And this is really where Logos Earth is going to come in to be able to show off the apps, talk about the genuineness of them with research, and be able to allow to use these apps inside a platform called Muni, where you can really get a better type of user experience from so many little apps that we use just day to day instead of having to download program after program and put them on. So this is looking at the Skynet from Saya and their little app store, which is just in its infancy being built out. And as you can see, the programs that they have are really nothing that we'd probably ever use as of yet. But this is going to allow everything from YouTube videos to be stored to your data to be stored at very high access speeds, then be released to who you choose, how you choose, and this will even eventually be able to build out something like an entire web browser where it's completely decentralized. Now, there's still one or two small holes in that, but this is pretty amazing what they can end up doing with this and running out of essentially an entire accessible blockchain that allows you to have distributed databases then made with smart contracts from that. But this all runs on this little Saya coin, but you're going to want to get that Saya coin from Bitcoin and then get that from dollars in its little micropayments to be able to run the services of this. So this is just one little app store they're working on. And we're seeing these little app stores in their infancy merge out of all different cryptocurrencies. The thing is, though, is that there's still not really a good website that says, okay, what networks are decentralized, what networks are not. This is something that Logos Earth Foundation wants to be able to investigate and show off these app stores that are merging onto the scene and show you in an organized way what apps you should be using for the latest and greatest whatever. This will ultimately have to get built out into Muni, and that's having an app store with it. So this app store is probably going to look a lot more like Steam for games, where some of the apps are plugins. Others of the apps have to download their protocols, a separate engine of itself, and put it on. And then some of the apps also will just install externally, where Steam installs a game where inside Windows you just have to run it separately. So creating a nice user interface of looking through a large app store will become essential for the decentralized space, as everything is moving to these little dApps, which I believe are going to look like applets inside an entire browser eventually. And that is going to happen sooner than later, as that's what we're already seeing getting created. So hopefully this makes sense, how we're going to solve the problems of today's municipalities, freelancers, people who work at home, and just government abroad with a better interface. We'll have to look into, obviously, use cases later, how this engine's going to work, and how the underlying infrastructure works. But getting this project started, we need to get people excited about it, and we need to show off how we're going to turn a dark government to a brighter government. And hopefully this app at least shows us what type of interface we'll at least be using for this type of transformation. So to leave off with, I'm going to show a few videos of some mock-ups of people building out UXs on Windows. And this is ultimately what we're going to first need to build out to show off Muni. Instead of building the program itself, we want to show up mock-ups of it at first so we can get people excited on board. And I'll put these videos at the very end.